Your mom's name lights up your phone, and you let it go to voicemail. Again. If you've done this more times than you can count, the psychology behind it might surprise you, because people who don't call their parents aren't necessarily cold or ungrateful. A 2022 study from the Journal of Family Psychology found that nearly 40% of adult children report feeling dread before calling their parents, even when the relationship isn't overtly toxic. The question isn't why you don't call, it's what calling costs you, and why your brain has decided the price is too high. Over the next 13 minutes, we're unpacking 5 psychological patterns that explain this behavior, from the guilt that paralyzes you to the uncomfortable truth most people won't say out loud. And fair warning, pattern number 4 is the one that makes people defensive, but it might be the most important one to hear. Let's start with the obvious one, the guilt. You know you should call. You think about it. You promise yourself you'll do it tomorrow. And then tomorrow becomes next week, and next week becomes a month. And suddenly the gap feels too wide to cross. Here's what most people don't understand about guilt. It doesn't motivate you to act. It paralyzes you. Psychologists call this guilt-induced avoidance, and it works like quicksand. The more you struggle against it, the deeper you sink. You didn't call on their birthday, so now calling feels like you'd have to explain the silence. You'd have to acknowledge the gap. You'd have to say something like, "Sorry, I've been distant," which means admitting you've been distant, which makes you feel like a terrible person, which makes you want to avoid the conversation even more. It's a loop, and the loop tightens every single day. A 2019 study from the University of Queensland tracked adult children who reported avoiding parental contact and found something fascinating. The primary barrier wasn't anger or resentment. It was shame. Shame about not calling more. The very feeling that should push you toward reconnection becomes the wall that keeps you apart. You're not avoiding them. You're avoiding the reflection of yourself as someone who doesn't call their parents. You're avoiding the identity of bad son or bad daughter that the silence seems to prove. And here's the cruelest part. Your parents might not even be upset. They might understand you're busy. They might just be happy to hear from you whenever. But in your head, you've built this narrative where they're hurt, disappointed, keeping score. So the call stops being a simple conversation. It becomes an apology tour, a performance of repentance. And who wants to sign up for that? There's this moment that happens. You finally decide you're going to call. You pick up the phone, your thumb hovers, and then you think, what do I even say? Not because you have nothing to talk about, but because you have to navigate the weight of everything you didn't say before. The call isn't just a call anymore. It's a confession, a trial, a reopening of a wound you've been trying to let scab over. So you put the phone down, and the guilt grows heavier, and the cycle continues. The twisted logic of it all is that guilt is supposed to be a corrective emotion. It's supposed to signal, hey, you violated your values, maybe adjust your behavior. But when guilt becomes chronic, it stops correcting and starts punishing. It stops being a compass and becomes a cage. You're stuck between wanting to connect and being too ashamed of the disconnection to try. And the longer it goes on, the more the relationship exists in this strange frozen state. Not quite estranged, but not quite close either. Just suspended, waiting for someone to make the first move, but both sides are too scared, or too tired, or too convinced it's too late. But let's say you push past the guilt. You actually make the call, and within 5 minutes, you remember why you've been putting it off. Because it's not just a conversation, it's work. There's this concept in psychology called emotional labor, and most people associate it with customer service jobs or teaching. Smiling when you're exhausted, being patient when you're frustrated, managing other people's feelings while suppressing your own. But emotional labor doesn't clock out when you leave work. Sometimes it's loudest in the relationships that are supposed to feel easiest. When you call your parents, you're not just talking, you're translating. You're code switching between the person you are and the person they need you to be. You're managing their anxiety about your life choices. You're performing the version of yourself they're comfortable with, even if that version stopped being accurate years ago. You rehearse the conversation before it happens. You know the topics to avoid. You know which parts of your life to edit out. You know the tone you need to strike. Enthusiastic enough that they don't worry, but not so honest that you have to explain things they won't understand. It's like putting on a costume. And costumes are exhausting to wear. Carl Jung talked about the concept of persona, the social mask we wear to meet the expectations of the world around us. For some people, the heaviest mask they wear isn't at work or with friends. It's with their parents. Because that's where the expectations were formed. That's where the blueprint was laid. And even when you've outgrown it, even when you've become someone completely different, they're still looking for the outline of who you used to be. You're 35, financially stable, living a life you chose, but on the phone, you're still defending your career path like you're 17, and they just found out you're not going to medical school. You're in a happy relationship, but you're still bracing for the subtle disappointment that you're not married yet, or that you married the wrong person, or that you're not giving them grandchildren on their timeline. The call becomes a negotiation, not of ideas, but of realities. Their reality, where you should be further along, more settled, more like them, and your reality, where you're doing the best you can with what you have, and somewhere in the middle of that negotiation, you lose the energy to keep explaining yourself. A study from the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships in 2021 found that adult children who reported high parental expectations were significantly more likely to avoid contact, not because of conflict, but because of fatigue, the sheer exhaustion of being misunderstood, of having to justify, of defending a life that doesn't need defending. And it's not always big things. Sometimes it's the small comments, the little digs wrapped in concern. You sound tired. Are you taking care of yourself? Which really means, I don't think you're taking care of yourself. Or, that's great, honey, in a tone that clearly communicates, it's not great. You're parsing subtext, reading between lines, managing their emotions while guarding your own. This is the part people don't talk about. Loving your parents and finding them draining aren't mutually exclusive. You can care deeply about someone and still need to protect your energy from them. Because some relationships, even good ones, even loving ones, require you to shrink parts of yourself to fit. And shrinking is tiring. So you don't call. Not because you don't love them, but because you don't have the energy to be someone you're not. The exhaustion makes sense when you realize it didn't start with adulthood. It started way earlier, in the first relationships you ever had. Because the way you learned to love, the way you learned to connect, came from watching and experiencing your parents. And sometimes, what you learn was that love isn't safe. Attachment theory, developed by psychologist John Bowlby, tells us that the bonds we form in childhood become the blueprint for how we navigate relationships as adults. It's not destiny, it's not determinism, but it's a pattern, a script written before you had the language to question it. There are people who grew up with anxious attachment. They learned that love is conditional, inconsistent. You had to perform, to please, to prove yourself worthy of affection. So as an adult, you might call your parents obsessively, checking in constantly, managing their emotions to feel secure. But eventually, you burn out. The anxiety that pushes you toward connection becomes the thing that makes connection unbearable. So you swing the other direction, you stop calling. Not because you don't care, but because you can't sustain the performance anymore. Then there are people with avoidant attachment. For them, closeness always came with a price. Maybe vulnerability was dismissed, maybe emotions were inconvenient. Maybe you learned early that needing people meant getting hurt, so you built walls, high ones. And now, as an adult, distance feels safer than intimacy. Calling your parents means letting them in, and letting people in has never ended well before. So you don't call, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. You're protecting the person you became by keeping away the patterns that shaped you. And then there's disorganized attachment, the most complex one, the one where you want connection and fear it simultaneously, where your parents were both the source of comfort and the source of pain. You learned that love is chaotic, unpredictable, so you reach out and then pull back. You call and then disappear for months. You're caught between the child who still wants their parents' approval and the adult who knows that getting close means reopening wounds that never fully healed. The thing about these patterns is that they're not choices, they're adaptations, survival strategies you developed when you were too young to know you were developing them. You learned how to love by watching the people who loved you. And if what you learned was that love requires you to abandon yourself, or that closeness leads to pain, or that connection is conditional on being someone you're not, well, the math becomes simple. You don't call because calling activates a pattern you've spent years trying to unlearn. Søren Kierkegaard wrote about the concept of repetition, this idea that we're haunted by the patterns of our past, doomed to relive them until we consciously break the cycle. Every time you pick up the phone to call your parents, you're not just making a call, you're stepping back into the dynamic that formed you. And sometimes that dynamic is the very thing you've been running from. This isn't about blame. Your parents were probably doing the best they could with the tools they were given. Hurt people, patterns get passed down like heirlooms. But understanding where the avoidance comes from doesn't make it easier to overcome, because the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. You can know, intellectually, that you're safe now, that you're an adult, that the call won't destroy you. But your nervous system still feels the echo of what it was like to need them and not get what you needed. Or to get love that came with conditions you couldn't meet. So you don't call, because calling isn't neutral. It's a doorway back into a version of yourself you're not sure you want to visit. Now we arrive at the part that makes people uncomfortable, the one most people won't say out loud. Because we're taught from birth that family's everything, that blood is thicker than water, that you owe your parents your loyalty, your time, your forgiveness, simply because they're your parents. But what if the relationship isn't good? What if it never was good? What if the reason you don't call isn't guilt or exhaustion or unresolved attachment, but because being in contact with them genuinely harms you? This is where people get defensive. They'll say, but they're your parents. They fed you. They raised you. They did their best. And maybe that's true. Maybe they did do their best, but sometimes someone's best still wasn't enough. Sometimes someone's best still left scars, and you're allowed to acknowledge that without being labeled ungrateful or cruel. There's a psychological concept called protective distancing, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Creating space between yourself and someone who threatens your well-being, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but out of survival. Because some relationships, even familial ones, cost more than they give. And at some point, you have to decide whether loyalty to them is worth disloyalty to yourself. This isn't about minor disagreements. This isn't about different political views or lifestyle choices. This is about patterns of behavior that are damaging, chronic criticism, manipulation, emotional volatility, boundary violations, relationships where every interaction leaves you feeling worse than before, where you spend days recovering from a 10-minute phone call, where their voice in your head is louder and crueler than any outside critic could ever be. And yet, we're told to keep trying, to forgive, to understand, to remember that they're getting older, that life is short, that you'll regret it when they're gone. But you know what else you'll regret? Spending your entire life setting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, sacrificing your peace, your mental health, your sense of self, because society says you're supposed to. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about the concept of master morality versus slave morality. Slave morality, he argued, keeps people chained to obligation, to guilt, to external rules about what they should do. Master morality is about defining your own values, deciding what you owe and to whom. And sometimes that means recognizing that the debt you think you owe was never real to begin with. You didn't ask to be born. You didn't sign a contract that said, in exchange for life, I will tolerate mistreatment indefinitely. Being someone's child doesn't mean you're required to endure harm. Love shouldn't require you to abandon yourself. And the hardest part? Admitting this doesn't make the love go away. You can love someone and still know they're not safe for you. You can grieve the parent you wish you had while protecting yourself from the parent you do have. These things can coexist. Messy, painful, true. Some people don't call their parents because the relationship is broken. Not in a way that can be fixed with better communication or therapy, or one more heart-to-heart conversation. Broken in a way that requires acceptance. Acceptance that this is what it is. That some gaps can't be bridged. That some losses have to be grieved while the person is still alive. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you someone who chose themselves. And that's not selfish. That's survival. Not every story gets a redemption arc. Not every relationship gets healed. And forcing connection where there's only pain doesn't honor anyone. Not them, not you. So if you don't call because calling hurts you, you're not broken. You're not cold. You're not failing at being human. You're protecting the person you fought so hard to become. And that matters more than obligation, more than guilt. More than what anyone else thinks you should do. So where does that leave you? With all this psychology, all these patterns, all this understanding, what do you actually do with it? The truth is, there's no universal answer. No one-size-fits-all solution. Some people will read their patterns, do the work, and rebuild the relationship. Some will realize that distance is the healthy choice and learn to live with it without guilt. And some will land somewhere in the middle, maintaining contact, but with boundaries they never had before. What matters is that you're honest, with yourself first, about what the relationship actually is, not what you wish it were, about what you can tolerate and what you can't, about whether the version of yourself you have to become to maintain connection is worth the cost. If the guilt is what's stopping you, you can interrupt the pattern. Schedule calls like appointments. Remove the decision fatigue. Decide that Sunday at 3 is parent time, and when Sunday at 3 arrives, you call. No negotiating with yourself. No spiral of should I or shouldn't I. You've already decided. You just execute. It won't erase the guilt immediately, but it will break the paralysis. Action, even imperfect action, is the antidote to shame. If it's the emotional labor that's draining you, boundaries become essential. You can love someone and still limit your exposure to them. 20 minutes once a week. Surface-level conversations that don't require you to defend your existence. You get to decide what you're willing to give, and you get to stop apologizing for protecting your energy. If it's the attachment wounds, that's deeper work, the kind that often requires therapy, or at least serious self-reflection. You're not just changing behavior. You're rewiring patterns that have been running in the background your entire life. It's slow, it's hard, but it's possible. You can learn new ways of connecting. You can build relationships that don't activate old wounds. You don't have to stay stuck in the script that was written for you. And if it's the uncomfortable truth, if the relationship genuinely isn't safe for you, then acceptance becomes the path. Not acceptance that makes you feel good, but acceptance that makes you feel free. You're allowed to grieve what you didn't get. You're allowed to mourn the parent-child relationship you deserved but never had. And you're allowed to move forward without carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that we are condemned to be free, meaning the burden of choice is always ours. No one else can tell you what your relationship with your parents should look like. Not society, not family, not even the versions of yourself from the past who made different choices. You have to decide, and then you have to live with that decision, knowing it won't feel perfect, but it might feel true. Some of you will call tonight, some of you won't call for another year, some of you will never call again. And all of those choices can be the right one, depending on the story you're living. The question was never, why don't you call your parents? The question is, what do you need to feel okay with whatever choice you make? And maybe the answer is permission. Permission to not have it figured out. Permission to change your mind. Permission to choose yourself, even when it feels selfish. Especially when it feels selfish. You don't owe anyone a relationship that costs you your peace, not even the people who gave you life. So, where does that leave you? What's the pattern you recognize in yourself? The guilt trap, the exhaustion, the attachment wound, the uncomfortable truth, or something else entirely I didn't cover? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments, not for engagement, but because these conversations matter. because someone reading your story might feel less alone in theirs. And if this video gave you something to think about, something to sit with, you know what to do. I'll be here next time with more psychology that cuts a little deeper than surface level. Take care of yourself, whatever that looks like for you.